Thank you very much for joining us again. Tell us, ये PTSD क्या है?
So focus on the T here. So T is a trauma. So let's say an individual has been exposed to this drastic, significant traumatic experience. Now this trauma keeps being relived and continues to have an impact on this individual's life even after the traumatic incident is long gone. Now that's PTSD for you. So 6% of people who are exposed to a traumatic accident end up having PTSD. This number rises up to almost 30%. Wow. If that trauma is like a mass disaster or rape. And some people believe that it may be even higher for war veterans. So that's the scale one is looking at.
तो इंडिया में लोग PTSD का बात बहुत ज़्यादा नहीं करते हैं, but should we be talking about PTSD?
People come for help. They may or may not realize it is PTSD. They might give it some other name because it's not as commonly used word like an anxiety disorder or a mood disorder or a depressive illness. But people do seek help. And I do feel कि PTSD के बारे में हमें बात करना चाहिए because various kinds of traumatic exposures are happening. And if people realize that seeking help will really make a difference, because it does. And the key aspect in PTSD is the earlier you seek treatment, I mean, as nearer to the trauma that you start the intervention, it can actually make a big difference.
PTSD, how does it manifest in a person?
So see it like this. Let's look at the trauma first. So here a trauma is directly being exposed to death, directly being exposed to grievous injury, directly being exposed to the threat of dying or grievous injury, abuse, especially sexual abuse. Now this could be a natural disaster. So let's say you were sleeping when an earthquake came and you had to rush for your life and you lost some neighbors and some people got injury. So that's a traumatic experience. It could be floods. It could be an act of sexual violence. It could be a part of, let's say, some accident, which had loss of life. It could be
mob violence.
Yes, it could be any form of violence, actually, not just mob violence. It could include, let's say, ragging done which went very violent or very drastic. So all of this and war. These are those traumas where when you are in there, you do realize that death and serious injury and serious harm is really around you. So either you are directly exposed to this, or somebody extremely close to you was directly affected or exposed to it, or sometimes, let's say, you keep reliving this because of, let's say you are working for law enforcement and somebody who's gone through an abuse keeps talking about the same abuse to you and the narrative you keep hearing. Sometimes that could also be a trigger. So that's what a trauma is. Now in PTSD, this trauma has a long lasting impact on you. So one part of it is, it keeps coming back. So whether it's in terms of dreams, recollections, you keep having those thoughts again and again, it's as though you are reliving it. So no matter where you are, it's like you are still in that situation and you are reliving it. You also experience almost continuous arousal, like you get startled very easily. A small sound makes you feel scared. You feel that palpitation, restlessness, sleep disturbance, or continuously you feel you need to avoid the trigger of trauma. It could be not merely sometimes even directly related. So for example, there have been people when they had experienced an earthquake, it took them a very long time to be able to sleep in their own homes. because you feel, what if it happens again, and how will I manage it? And so that aspect of avoidance, and then you might start avoiding people who remind you of that trauma, or if there is any which way any conversation can even touch this topic even indirectly, you start avoiding that. So all this is a part of that the post-traumatic, and the change in the mindset that happens. You may start feeling helpless, you feel negative, sometimes you take a lot of self-blame, or you just blame somebody else, and that becomes a part of your life. Your moods get affected. It's a very difficult experience, because post-traumatic stress disorder is like you experiencing an intense sense of horror, and the horror never leaving you even after that incident is gone. And that's how it affects your life, because if it was, let's say, an act of sexual violence, then you may not be able to trust anybody, you may not be able to feel companionate or intimate with anybody, you may see everybody with a sense of mistrust, you may not feel good about your own self. Sometimes victims start blaming their own selves, even though it was absolutely never a fault of theirs.
You may have experienced something in your childhood, लेकिन आपको suddenly 15 years later या 20 years later trauma starts setting in. ऐसा हो सकता है कि इतने सालों बाद it strikes you?
Post-traumatic stress disorder would typically start around the trauma, right? Reliving some past experience which would have been a difficult experience after several years may or may not be a part of the PTSD. I don't think that should be linked with this.
लेकिन बहुत लोगों का ये भी behavior है कि वो suppress कर देते हैं, right? They don't like to confront it immediately, and then a couple of years later, again it's triggered. The same thing is triggered, and then you have to accept it, and then it.
But these are two
coming
separate
back.
issues.
Okay.
One is that you are so see, to look at trauma treatment, you need to start treatment very soon. That's something which is very important, especially, let's say, some of these, the hyperarousal component of trauma. So if the mind and body start to relax soon enough, immediately after the trauma, and the thought process can be helped to prevent it from becoming into a vicious negative cycle, it can actually make a very big difference. There's a lot of evidence about groups working in trauma. So when similar people who've gone through a similar trauma, again war veterans is an example, that identification, that validation, that affirmation, that feeling of oneness and support from people can actually help a lot. And so that's why one needs to understand that here you are looking at a significant impact of a trauma and then the impact continuing. So that's how you understand PTSD.
So describe to us the difference between addressing trauma immediately and pushing it, and then perhaps confronting it a couple of years later.
It's not merely about confronting the trauma, it's about resolving the experience of trauma in a way that it stops having a negative impact on your life. You may have some thoughts that may get triggered anytime in the future, but it's about life not getting impaired because of that. I think that's what one needs to understand. It's human that if you have, so let's say you are in a car and you have a very, very bad accident, and let's say somebody has grievous injury, somebody's life is lost, and you don't feel like sitting in a car, you don't sit in a car for a very, very long time, and gradually you stop going out, the thoughts don't leave you, you can't sleep, you feel negative, you have a lot of blame happening, you feel distressed, your relationships start getting affected, work start getting affected, that's a PTSD happening. Now let's say you're fine, you've handled it, you've addressed it, and years down you saw some other accident, and that memory triggered and you felt something about it, and then it passed away on its own. That's normal. We will keep on having triggers which will bring a state dependent learning of sorts, and that's human, which will happen to us throughout our life.
बहुत लोग ये कहते हैं कि hypnotherapy से you can really improve and you can heal. As a psychiatrist, what is your take on that?
I think the right way to look at PTSD is biological intervention. जहाँ जहाँ ज़रूरत है वहाँ दवा देना. There is a role and we need to utilize it. Cognitive behavioral therapy, because it helps in the way you are thinking. It helps you to manage the behavioral patterns. There is a role of mindfulness, relaxation, various relaxing techniques, including self-hypnosis, guided imagery, relaxation, which help you to relax. There's a lot of evidence about group therapy, because it gives you a different kind of a positive experience, and you learn from one another to be able to come out of a significant experience. Art-based therapies also have a role to play. There is robust evidence about how social support systems can make a huge impact in the treatment, and I think that's the way to look at it. So you're looking at medication, psychotherapy, social support, group therapy, and that's how you look at it.
That how long do you think a patient will take to come out of PTSD, or is it is very subjective?
It is subjective. I just feel that intervention should be very early. I think that's the key with PTSD. Society needs to empathize with people who've gone through trauma. And like what I said earlier, is the way to understand this, that for PTSD, your trauma is not a cross-sectional here and now experience. It's like living in trauma continuously.